let's go back to the little Turing machine. Here's a formalism, a perfectly good formalism for computational science, the Turing machine formalism. Now note, if your purpose in doing computational science is, as was the purpose of the founders of computation theory, Gödel, Erbrant, Turing, Kleene, Emil Post, simply to determine what mathematical functions are in principle commutable. If you abstract from little problems like how much real time will it take, get as much time as you wanted and as much tape as you wanted, as long a tape as you wanted, what mathematical functions are in principle computable? And there are other derivative notions like semi-computable and so on. Then all these different formalisms can be regarded as equivalent, because the great result that was realized around roughly 1934 was the class of functions which are computable is enormously stable. Changing with the formalism you use for computation theory won't change the class. But the fact that for that purpose, the purposes of the theory of a certain class of functions, it doesn't matter which formalism you use, doesn't mean that it's irrelevant from every point of view. For example, another purpose, a man called Manuel Blum wrote a thesis. It happened to be with Hartley Rogers and myself as the second reader at MIT in the early 60s, inventing a field called complexity theory. Once you start being interested in how fast can you compute something, can you really compute it in real time, then formalisms which were equivalent from the first point of view become highly inequivalent, or may become highly inequivalent. Again, if our purpose isn't with computing functions at all, but with using, and this is the idea after all of functionalism, but with using computational formalisms as proposed, purported, hypothetical models of the mind, either the human species or of any species, then the formalism has to be such that the states are of the right logical sort to be psychological states. And the states of a Turing machine are very clearly not. For one thing, states in this sense, A, B, C, D, have very important properties. The machine can mean exactly one of them at a time. And that would be very useful for psychology. Even Gerald Ford was capable of being in more than one psychological state at one time. Well, I can now wrap this up pretty quickly. Now, at the beginning of one of these papers, the paper called Philosophy in Our Mental Life, I expanded on my qualms, which I've just described, about supposing that psychological states of human beings are literally Turing machine states. And I recognized that the difficulty with the notion of psychological isomorphism is that it presupposes the notion of something's being a functional or psychological description. In other words, it presupposes that we've already got a formalism. And I went on to say that it's for that reason that in my previous papers I say I'd use this Turing machine model, but that was no good. But that was no good for the reasons I've just pointed out, because Turing machine states just can't be psychological states. But I added, it does not seem fatally sloppy to me, although it is sloppy, I wrote. It's not fatally sloppy, but it is sloppy, if we apply the notion to systems for which we have no detailed idea at present what the normal form description would look like, systems like ourselves. I claim that even if we don't have any idea what a, quote, comprehensive psychological theory, unquote, would look like, we know enough to point out illuminating differences between any possible psychological theory, or even a functional description of an automaton, and a physical description. The most important of these differences is this, that systems that are models of the same psychological theory, systems that are psychologically isomorphic, so to speak, that's the terminology I introduced, do not have to be in the same physical state in order to count as being in the same functional state. And of course, there is actually a wonderful episode of Star Wars in which one of the more lovable androids, one of the officers wants to take it apart because it's only a machine, and another officer serves as a defense attorney and convinces everyone that it's so lovable that it really has a mind, right? Clearly that machine isn't in the same physical state as a human being in terms of DNA, neurons, and so on, but at a certain level of abstraction it is in the same psychological state. A human being, a robot with a positronic brain, imagined in Isaac Asimov's science fiction, and a disembodied spirit might be psychologically isomorphic, and if they were, they could be in the same psychological states without ever being in the same physical state. At this point, although I was still a functionalist, I had begun to be aware of a very serious problem for the position. Originally, the thesis of functionalism was that our mental states are identical with our functional states, where the notion of a functional state was made clear by identifying it with the notion of a Turing machine or a probabilistic automaton state. But as I just pointed out, our mental states cannot literally be Turing machine states. They don't have the right sorts of properties. So I replaced the notion of a Turing machine description with the notion of the sort of description that will be provided by an ideal psychological theory. What is an ideal psychological theory? Well, we'll know what that is when we have the normal form for psychological theories that I had earlier claimed must be an inevitable part of the program of psychology to provide. But is it really any part of the program of psychology to provide any such thing? So we come to the question of the utopian character of functionalism. A psychological theory, in the ordinary sense, doesn't pretend to give a complete description of all of a human being's, or even a rat's, psychological states, even if we assume we know what we mean by talking of all of an organism's psychological states. Nor does a psychological theory in the ordinary sense pretend to give all of the causal relations between psychological states. And that's so whether you think of vernacular psychological theories, Chomskyan theories, behaviorist theories, Freudian theories, or whatever. No one has ever claimed to provide a theory in which so much information about the state of believing, say, that there are cows in Romania, and about the connections between that state and other psychological states, and between all of these states and sensory inputs and behavioral outputs, is provided to individuate the state of believing that there are cows in Romania. A machine table does distinguish a functional state of a Turing machine from all other functional states of that machine. It individuates that state in the sense of providing a necessary sufficient condition for being that state. Even if we're charitable, we shall have to admit that the ideal psychological theory that I envisage in my functionalist papers, the kind of theory that could provide as complete a description of our psychological states as a Turing machine table provides of the functional states of a computer, is an utterly utopian project. And if we're uncharitable, we'll say it's we know not what. This sort of utopianism is also an excellent illustration of what is called scientism. Scientism is not the same thing as respect for science, or desire to learn the results of science, or conviction that those results are relevant to philosophical investigation. But when one is in a frame of mind, as I was, in which one fails to distinguish between science in the sense in which science is actually done in laboratories and the most utopian sort of speculation, then what is indeed in the grip of scientism.